On June 17, 2026, the NATO Secretary General held a press conference in Brussels and said something that, if you were not listening with the right kind of attention, sounded like a strong statement of alliance solidarity and shared purpose. He said, NATO stands firmly with its members and partners in the region and continues to monitor the situation with the utmost seriousness. I want you to hold that statement. Specifically, I want you to hold a single word within it. The word is monitor. Because on that same day, a senior Iranian military commander gave an interview to the semi-official Tasnim news agency and made a statement that nearly every Western outlet reported as Iranian bluster and rhetorical inflation. He said that Iran had crossed 7 thresholds that our adversaries explicitly stated would guarantee a military response and had crossed them without consequence. That number is very specific, not several thresholds, not a number of thresholds, and 7. And the characterization he chose for what followed, without consequence, not without a proportionate response, without consequence, meaning nothing of strategic significance changed for Iran as a result. Monitor on one side, 7 thresholds without consequence on the other. If the Iranian commander's account is even approximately accurate, then what you are witnessing in this conflict is not primarily a military confrontation. You are witnessing a deterrence architecture, one that took decades and enormous allied investment to build, in the process of being dismantled from below, piece by piece, threshold by threshold, tested and probed and found to be less sturdy than its architects believed. While the alliance responsible for maintaining it issues statements about monitoring. Today I'm going to show you why deterrence collapse is not a dramatic, sudden, visible event. It is a process. It is a staircase with many small steps. And you frequently only recognize you have descended it all the way when you look up from the bottom and see how high the top now seems. Every Western policy outlet is treating NATO's hesitation as primarily a political story. Is the alliance internally divided? Is American commitment to European and Middle Eastern partners wavering? Is this fundamentally about domestic political calculations in Washington? CNN is running panels about transatlantic tensions and burden-sharing disputes. The Economist is analyzing European defense spending trajectories against NATO targets. Politico Brussels is counting which member governments support what positions. All of them are asking the wrong question. The right question is structural and strategic, not political. Can a deterrent system that was designed in 1949 for a specific kind of adversary, in a specific geopolitical environment, for a specific set of contingencies, continue to function credibly against the adversary whose entire strategic model is built on systematically identifying and exploiting the gaps between that system's stated commitments and its actual responses? In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to walk you through what I call the Kindleberger trap in reverse. I'm going to explain where the original Kindleberger concept comes from, why it applies to what is happening with NATO and Iran right now in a way that should alarm every serious observer of the international order, and why the hesitation you are seeing from the alliance is not primarily an accident of political circumstance or a temporary failure of leadership. It is the outcome that the Iranian strategy was specifically designed to produce, step by step, over years of patient empirical testing. The economist Charles Kindleberger, writing in 1973 in his landmark historical analysis of the Great Depression of the 1930s, identified what he called the hegemonic stability problem. The core of his argument was both simple and profound. Stable international systems require the presence of a dominant power that is both capable of and willing to bear the costs of providing systemic stability for everyone. Setting and enforcing the rules of the international order, acting as the lender of last resort during financial crises, absorbing economic shocks so that smaller actors do not have to absorb them individually, providing the public goods of security and open commerce that everyone benefits from, and that no individual actor has sufficient incentive to provide alone. When the dominant power withdraws from that role or becomes unwilling to continue bearing those costs, the system does not smoothly redistribute the burden to other members. It collapses into the gap. The 1930s, Kindleberger argued, saw Britain unable to continue maintaining hegemonic stability, and the United States politically unwilling to assume it. And the result was not an orderly transition. It was a catastrophic 20-year gap that produced the Great Depression and the Second World War. Political scientists subsequently identified a specific version of this danger that they called the Kindleberger trap, the situation that arises when a rising power is not yet willing or ready to assume the full cost of hegemonic leadership at precisely the same moment that the incumbent dominant power is becoming unwilling or unable to bear those costs. The international system falls into that gap between the two. The trap is the gap itself. Now, here is the reversal that makes this framework directly relevant to what we are watching right now. The Kindleberger trap, as it is usually discussed, applies to transitions between hegemons, to the dangerous gap in the handoff of global leadership. What Iran appears to have constructed is something structurally different and arguably more insidious, a strategy designed to widen the Kindleberger gap from below without being a rising hegemon at all and without needing to assume the costs of hegemonic leadership. Iran does not need to replace NATO as the security guarantor of the Middle East. It does not need to build a counter-alliance or achieve military parity. It only needs to make the costs of NATO's continued leadership role in the region high enough that NATO becomes hesitant, while simultaneously making the gap between that hesitance and the appearance of credible deterrence wide enough to operate inside of, freely and with increasing confidence. You do not need to defeat the lion. You need to make the lion uncertain enough about whether it is worth leaving its cave that it stays in the cave while you move through the forest. This is the Kindleberger trap in reverse, and the evidence for it is embedded in the specific thresholds the Iranian commander described. There are 5 documented thresholds that Iran or Iranian-affiliated forces have crossed in the past 18 months that were, based on prior explicit Western official statements, supposed to trigger specific military responses. Let me walk through each one carefully, because the cumulative pattern is what matters. Threshold number 1, strikes producing American military casualties. In late 2023, a drone strike at Tower 22 in Jordan killed 3 American service members and wounded more than 40. This was not a close call or an ambiguous incident. 3 Americans died. The official American deterrence position before this incident had been stated with considerable clarity by multiple senior officials. Any Iranian-affiliated attack that produces American military casualties would generate a serious and direct military response. The actual response was a series of airstrikes against Iranian-affiliated militia infrastructure in Iraq and Syria, carried out carefully, described by every independent military analyst who assessed them as designed to avoid escalation, deliberately structured to not strike Iranian territory directly, and concluded quickly. The deterrence statement said that American casualties would produce a serious response. The actual response was measured, brief, and calibrated to avoid the escalation the deterrence language had implied was automatic. Iran's intelligence apparatus read that gap. Threshold number 2, sustained attacks on international shipping in a strategically critical waterway. The Houthi campaign against Red Sea shipping, documented exhaustively by Lloyd's of London insurance reports, the International Chamber of Commerce, UN Security Council briefings, and the monitoring reports of the Yemen panel of experts, has disrupted one of the world's most commercially critical maritime routes continuously for 18 months. The stated threshold in NATO maritime doctrine and an explicit American naval policy for this kind of sustained interference with freedom of navigation was unambiguous. It would require a coalition military response sufficient in scale and duration to restore safe passage for commercial vessels. The actual response has been Operation Prosperity Guardian, which has involved active naval patrols and some intercept operations, but has not restored safe passage to the route. Major commercial shipping companies continue, as of the date of this video, to route their vessels around the Cape of Good Hope, adding approximately 10 days to transit times and thousands of dollars per container to their costs, rather than through the Red Sea. The deterrence statement said freedom of navigation would be protected. The operational reality is that the route has been compromised for a year and a half. The gap between statement and reality is documented and undeniable. Threshold number 3, direct ballistic missile attacks against the territory of a major American ally. The explicit threshold for Iranian state-level ballistic missile attacks directly striking Israeli territory had been stated in American policy, in UN Security Council resolutions, and in the statements of European governments as representing a categorically severe escalation, requiring a categorically severe response. When those attacks occurred, the response was active Israeli and allied air defense, an Israeli counterstrike against specific Iranian military infrastructure, and a rapid rapid return to what American officials explicitly described as calibrated restraint. The escalation ladder was climbed and then deliberately descended without the magnitude of response that the deterrence threshold language had specified. Threshold number 4, attacks on Israeli civilian population centers. UN Security Council resolutions and multiple American and European government statements have consistently described deliberate attacks on Israeli civilian areas as crossing a line that would produce a significant international response beyond bilateral Israeli military action. Multiple attacks have occurred. The international response in each case has been characterized by diplomatic statements expressing condemnation, some targeted sanctions against specific individuals, and formal expressions of solidarity. Condemnation is not deterrence. It is the diplomatic acknowledgement that a threshold was crossed without the operational consequence that was supposed to follow from crossing it. Threshold number 5, nuclear enrichment at levels inconsistent with civilian purposes. The IAEA has documented Iranian uranium enrichment at 60% purity and above, a level that has no credible civilian application in the Iranian energy program, and which American officials from multiple administrations had previously characterized as requiring a response that went beyond diplomatic protest. The response to documented enrichment at this level has been consistently diplomatic protest. 5 thresholds. 5 systematic gaps between the stated deterrence commitment and the actual operational response, and an Iranian commander claiming 7, which means the list I have just walked through is probably incomplete. Okay? Does that pattern, 5 documented gaps on a list the adversary says has 7 entries, tell you something about the structural integrity of the deterrence architecture? Because this is not a series of independent political miscalculations by different administrations making different situational judgments. This is a recognizable pattern of an adversary systematically probing the gap between what a deterrence system says it will do and what it actually does, and finding that gap to be real, predictable, and wide enough to walk through. Now, I want to give you the steelman, the strongest argument against the deterrence collapse thesis, because it is a genuinely strong argument that serious people make seriously. The case against my framing is this. What I'm calling gaps in deterrence, a sophisticated alternative analyst would call deliberate and appropriate calibration by a mature alliance managing extraordinary complexity in a nuclear-adjacent environment. The argument is NATO and the United States are not failing to enforce their stated deterrence thresholds. They are making conscious and rational choices to avoid escalation in an environment where miscalculation could produce consequences far worse than accepting some Iranian threshold crossings. The calibration is the strategy, a great power that responds with maximum stated force to every single provocation, regardless of the risks of escalation, is not a stable deterrent. It is a hair trigger in a crowded room. The measured responses reflect not weakness, but the sophisticated management of an extraordinarily dangerous situation by people who understand what full escalation looks like. That argument is made seriously by serious people. I want you to hold it with genuine respect. But here is what it cannot explain. It cannot explain why the cumulative signal produced by those calibrated responses has been a demonstration, empirically documented through repeated Iranian threshold crossings, that the gap between stated deterrence and actual response is real, predictable in its approximate scale, and exploitable by a sufficiently patient adversary. Even if every individual American and NATO decision was individually wise, individually calibrated, and individually appropriate to the specific circumstances, the cumulative effect of those individually justified decisions has been to teach Iran's strategic planners something extremely valuable. That the gap between the deterrence architecture's stated commitments and its actual responses is not a narrow exception for rare extreme circumstances. It is a wide and predictable space that an adversary can learn to operate within. You can have the best reasons in the world for not enforcing a threshold. The adversary only observes that the threshold was not enforced. And once that observation has been made and confirmed 7 times, it cannot be unmade by issuing a stronger statement. This is the Kindleberger trap in reverse, running in real time. The deterrence system built for a specific kind of adversary, one that respected stated thresholds because it genuinely feared stated responses, is now confronting an adversary that has learned through patient empirical testing over 18 months that the stated and actual responses are systematically different. Once that gap is empirically established, it is part of the strategic landscape. You cannot restore deterrence credibility through stronger language. You can only restore it through actions that actually impose costs at the level the original language implied. And those actions, given the Strait of Hormuz calculation and the proxy network and the oil price sensitivity and the democratic political cost function in every allied capital, are precisely the actions that the system has been repeatedly calibrated to avoid. Here's the synthesis. NATO issued a statement about monitoring. The Iranian commander said 7 thresholds crossed without consequence. Those are not 2 different framings of the same military situation. They are 2 descriptions of a deterrence architecture that is not performing the function it was built to perform. The Kindleberger trap in reverse is the method by which Iran has created and is widening that performance gap. Probe each threshold with a manageable action, read the response. Probe the next threshold with a slightly larger action, observe whether the gap in the response pattern holds, and repeat until the pattern is established beyond reasonable doubt. That methodology is working. The patient giant in Beijing is watching this sequence more carefully than any other actor on Earth. Not because China wants Iran to succeed in any particular military objective, because China is studying the methodology itself. The Kindleberger trap in reverse is a technique. If threshold probing can successfully demonstrate the gap between a deterrence architecture and its actual enforcement against Iran in the Middle East, the same methodology can, in principle, be used to probe the gap between the deterrence architecture governing Taiwan and its actual enforcement. Beijing is not taking notes on Iran's military capabilities. It is taking notes on how you find and widen the gap between what a deterrence system says and what it does. 3 things to watch in the next 48 to 72 hours. First, watch whether any NATO member government makes a statement that changes the language from monitoring the situation to something that includes a defined threshold with a defined and specific consequence. A change in the specificity of the language signals a change in the political calculation inside the alliance about whether the gap is sustainable. Second, watch whether Iran's military commander repeats or elaborates the 7 thresholds claim in any additional forum. If that specific framing is amplified and elaborated by Iranian state media and official channels in the days following the original statement, it is part of a deliberate strategic communication campaign designed to signal to all observers that the gap has been documented and used. If it disappears from Iranian communications, it was tactical signaling for a specific audience at a specific moment. Third, watch European oil futures, and specifically the spread between the current Brent crude price and the price of futures contracts settling 3 to 6 months from now. If that spread widens significantly, the market is pricing a longer duration regional uncertainty than the current diplomatic language implies, and the market tends to be more honest about the medium-term outlook than official statements. Your homework: read Charles Kindleberger's 1973 work, The World in Depression, 1929 to 1939. Specifically the chapters where he develops the hegemonic stability argument and the analysis of why the absence of a stabilizing leader produced catastrophic outcomes. The book is available in most university libraries and in many public library systems. Then read the full text of the current NATO Secretary General's statement on the regional situation, not just the clips that were reported in the news cycle. Then come to the comments and tell me whether you think the Kindleberger gap I have described is a real structural feature of the current situation. And if so, who closes it, when, and at what cost? I want to be challenged, and I want to be shown what I am missing. Because the question that I keep arriving at, the one that I cannot reason my way out of, is this: if deterrence requires that stated thresholds are actually enforced at the level that the stated language implies, and if the political, economic, and military costs of enforcing them at that level have become genuinely prohibitive within the constraints of democratic governance and real-world alliance management, then is what we are calling deterrence still deterrence? Or has it quietly become something that looks like deterrence from the outside but functions differently, and that we will only name correctly and understand correctly after we understand what it failed to prevent? There is a specific mechanism by which the Kindleberger trap in reverse has compounded its effect across the 5 thresholds I described, and naming that mechanism is essential for understanding why the gap is not self-correcting. The mechanism is what I would call deterrence memory loss, and it works as follows. Each time a stated threshold is probed and the actual response falls short of what the deterrence language implied, the adversary gains 2 things. First, the empirical data point. This threshold can be crossed at this cost. Second, and more importantly, the adversary gains the knowledge that the adversary's decision-making system has now processed this threshold crossing and produced a calibrated response rather than the stated response. That second piece of knowledge is durable. It tells the adversary that the decision-making system has, at least once, and now demonstrably, chosen the calibrated option over the stated option. And it tells the adversary something precise about the internal cost-benefit thresholds that produce that choice. NATO's deterrence architecture was designed to be self-reinforcing. The credibility of the stated thresholds would deter the adversary from probing them, which would mean the thresholds were never actually tested, which would mean their credibility would be maintained. This design works well against adversaries who accept the credibility of the stated thresholds and do not probe them. It works poorly against an adversary whose strategy is specifically built around probing the thresholds at a cost low enough that the system prefers calibration over escalation. The Kindleberger trap in reverse is precisely the strategy of probing below the escalation preference threshold again and again until the pattern of calibrated responses has itself become the documented reality that replaces the stated deterrence language as the adversary's working assumption. Consider how this interacts with alliance cohesion, which is a dimension of the deterrence architecture that the individual threshold crossings do not capture. NATO is not a single actor. It is a consensus-based alliance of 32 sovereign governments with different geographic exposures to the Iranian threat, different economic relationships with Iran and with the countries whose oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz, different domestic political constraints on military commitment, and different historical relationships with the concept of expeditionary military engagement beyond NATO's treaty area. Each threshold crossing that produces a calibrated rather than a stated response does not only update Iran's estimate of the threshold, it also creates a new precedent that any NATO member government can cite domestically when its population asks why the alliance did not respond more forcefully. The precedents accumulate inside the alliance, as well as in Iranian strategic calculation. An alliance that has accepted 5 threshold crossings with calibrated responses is an alliance that has established an internal precedent, making the 6th and 7th crossings easier to accept with calibrated responses, because the political cost of departing from the established pattern is itself now a real consideration.